Hi. Welcome to On the Contrary by IDR. We try to, in this podcast, bring together people with different lived experiences to talk about a common thematic area so that they can approach it from all the diversity that they have, and we can try and find some kind of common ground or common understanding. Today, we're talking about what it means to tell the truth in times of crisis or to report on what's happening in the world, and also what that costs. So, when conflict and catastrophe are making headlines everywhere, what is the emotional toll of covering that? And does that often go unseen? And to do that, we're going to talk to both of you. So Mark Cabra is a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative journalist who led technology and data work on the Panama Papers. But after years of intense reporting, you burnt out and began advocating for mental health in journalism, co-founding the Self-Investigation project that supports newsroom well-being. And Nat Kendall-Taylor is a cognitive anthropologist and the CEO of the Frameworks Institute, which is a communications think tank based out of the United States. His work focuses on how the media frames complex social issues, from migration to violence, and how these narratives shape what the public understands, feels, and believes is possible. Together, I'm hoping that you guys are going to help us understand, can the media inform without causing harm, and whether that is harm to their audiences or to the people who are doing the informing, and how do we, in today's day and age, hold space for both truth but also for care. So to start us off, I think we can just start with your own relationship to this work. Mar, I'm going to ask you, what did covering the Panama Papers teach you about the personal cost of high-stakes journalism, but also ask you to please, if you could, in a couple of sentences, explain what the Panama Papers were.
So the Panama Papers was an investigation that was published in 2016 by a group of almost 400 reporters from all over the world that collaborated in secret over what was then the largest leak-based investigation in journalism history. So 11.5 million files that exposed the rich and the powerful. And what were their tricks to do things like evading taxes and creating higher inequality in our countries. And there were high-level people, from top politicians to soccer players to singers to terrorists in the papers, and we exposed their names so that we changed the way we look at this parallel economy that is being created by the powerful. And it was one of the most impactful investigations in journalism history. I'm not saying that because I participated in it. It really was because the power of collaboration. There was impact in pretty much every country that we published in at so many levels. There was money being recovered in evaded taxes. There was laws being changed for long-lasting impact. And there was also impact at a professional level. We won many awards, including the Pulitzer Prize, which, I was a Spaniard in my early 30s. I would have never, ever, ever imagined I would have a Pulitzer Prize. And I thought that would be the top of my career and the highest point in my life. And it was the top of my career, but not the highest point in my life. It was one of the lowest points in my personal life. I felt exhausted physically and emotionally. I hated my job. I was very negative. I just didn't want to do what I had been doing for so many years anymore. And I thought there was something wrong with me. I thought I was missing something that the others had, and I didn't. In reality, what had happened to me is that I had burnt out. And burnout causes all those things: negativity, chronic stress built over time, therefore chronic exhaustion, detachment. So all those signs were signs that I had gone too far. So to me, the Panama Papers had this other lesson that I had to learn, which is that if you don't take care of yourself, your body, your mind, your emotions are going to stop you at some point. And I'm very grateful, actually, that my body stopped me so that I can now learn how to do this very important task of being a journalist, of telling the truth, or at least trying to make sense of this complex world in a healthier way. We need to be well to do our jobs, and we need to put ourselves first.
Nat, How do you think that media exposure to conflict, and there is a lot of conflict happening around the world today, how does it impact the public's emotional response, cognitive response, and also their belief that they can take action or do anything about it?
Yeah, so the work that I do is very different than the work that you do. I've never won a Pulitzer.
Well,
I am considering though whether I have burnout after hearing about those symptoms.
I was going to say at least you didn't burn out, but
I'll go back to that maybe at the end, and I'll be a little self-reflective after this. So what I do is I study how the information that people receive affects how they think about issues, how they feel about issues, and how they act on issues. And I'm part of an organization that conducts research investigating those thoughts, feelings, responses. And a lot of our work is around dominant presentation that people receive around crisis, emergency, catastrophe, which in one aspect is real. Like these are real, urgent, on fire issues. We do a lot of work on immigration, a lot of work on public health, a lot of work on criminal legal reform. And those are issues that factually are urgent and dire and on fire. But what we find is that presenting those issues continually, persistently, as crises, as on fire, as the next thing that's going to drop out of the sky, doesn't have the intended effect that we as communicators want to have when we present urgency, crisis, which is to motivate and engage people, to get people to realize that these issues are real, they're urgent, they're being felt and experienced, and they require action. What ends up happening instead, and there's a lot of work that's been conducted on this outside of my organization, is that when presented with an endless stream of crisis, 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 emergency, 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 people's response is to turn it off and tune out. The youth mental health crisis becomes yet another crisis that I know about, but that I know nothing we can do about. And therefore I put it on the pile of other big, bad, dire, and on fire social issues that I know are there, but that I have zero sense we can do anything about. So coming from very good places, the progressive advocates who we work with are experts at crisis and emergency, and have realized that unfortunately just telling people how bad an issue is does not for change make, and actually can have one of these backfire effects where it makes people less engaged, less willing to participate, less willing to come along. This kind of emergency inflation and crisis fatigue is increasingly being experienced across a wide range of issues. And I think the really interesting question, I'm not so interested in whether that happens or not. I'm pretty confident that happens as a thing. That's a thing that happens. I think the more interesting question is, what can we do about it? And so there's a quite elegant solution, which is solutions. That if we can present messages, and you know this very well, right? If we can present messages that clearly establish an urgency and a gravity of a situation, and that's what kind of pulls people in, but balance that with an equal sense of, and I don't mean this in the kind of woo-woo, hopey, changey kind of way, of like hope. The positive outcomes are possible, that we know about solutions, that they exist in places, communities are doing them, they result in these outcomes. So this balance between a sense of crisis or urgency and a sense of efficacy or solutions, that it's that combination that is this kind of almost magical combination that pulls people in, gives them a place to go, and kind of starts to turn down or tune out that sense of paralysis that results from an endless stream of bigger and badder issues that we are up against.
So, okay, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that kind of reporting that was a mix of, okay, this is urgent, but here are solutions, here's what people are doing, I imagine would be slower reporting and perhaps less breaking news, same visuals. I'm speaking about what happens in India, which is like the same visuals over and over again of like terrible things that are going wrong. So if we were to talk about balancing urgency, because some things are urgent, and accuracy, which as journalists we're all striving to do, with care, both inside the newsroom and for the messaging that we use and we put out, what would that look like?
And so I'm not a journalist. I should be very candid about that. I work with some and know some. And I know that there is a vein or a stream subfield within journalism that's really interested in the accountability and responsibility that journalists have to the way that issues are framed. I've had a lot of conversations with journalists who think that their job is just to present the truth. And my position in those conversations has been an unpopular one, frequently, of saying, like, there's no such thing as, like, you're always framing an issue. The decisions that you make about the way that you position these issues has an impact. And I think increasingly, like over the last 10 years, a lot of journalists are attuned, have kind of maybe moved from this, I just present the facts, to a sense of accountability and responsibility in the stories that we tell. And I think that accountability is to the audiences with whom journalists communicate. It's also to, I would think, to the field of journalism as well. And so I don't think it's a hard pitch to make, that journalists and their stories do more than just convey the truth. They shape how people understand issues, how people respond to them. And I guess my biggest wish is to collaborate more with journalists, to work on kind of how the work that we do on mindsets and narratives and what we know about the decisions that we make and how we say what we have to say, influencing the things that I think journalists care about, how we can kind of bring some of that into journalistic practice as a way that adds value and is obviously respectful to the incredible expertise that journalists bring to that endeavor as well.
And I wish you success with that, because we need that knowledge, this evidence-based knowledge on what works. And there's a big crisis in journalism. We are an industry that is dying. There's a business model in decline. People don't trust journalists and the media anymore. So we need to acknowledge that that's the reality. A lot of my colleagues are working in very precarious conditions and are doing what they can with very little resources. We need to look at news in a different way in how we produce them and how we treat people that we work with. It's two different sides, right? So there's a lot of conversation in journalism also around trauma-informed reporting. I used to be a TV journalist at the beginning of my career, and I would be like with my microphone running around, it's like asking people very quick answers, and I just wanted them to say what my bosses told me we needed for TV. I didn't care back then, quote unquote care. I mean, I'm a human being, but like I just wanted the quote and out, you know, instead of like saying, what do you want to say? And this is key, especially in situations where there's like been a crisis, where there's been a conflict, where there's been a violence, you know. In Spain recently, we had a big disaster, the biggest natural disaster in our history, which was a flood where dozens of people died. And I saw a lot of my colleagues just going around asking people who had lost everything just for that quote, and then leaving them hanging after they had poured their heart out, leaving them hanging without the lights of the TV and the camera crew. We cannot do that to people. Those type of situations also do harm to the journalists that are reporting. And I think that we need to get trained in journalism around how to deal with potential traumatic situations. We need to get trained with how to deal with hate. Journalists are at the center of every hateful message right now. And we don't get training on that. We're like firefighters. We're like, you know, frontline responders. And that's why I co-founded a nonprofit called The Self-Investigation that supports journalists to deal with their mental health challenges and to be prepared to deal with these very complex situations. The reason why I'm talking about that now, in the question that you asked us, right, is because imagine these very stressed individuals, right, journalists, who are working under precarious conditions, under a lot of pressure, who are like exposed to potentially traumatic imagery, either like on the ground or online, that then have to tell the world, oh, I'm going to make sense of this complex world we live in, and this is the story. It is very difficult to do that. We're not superhumans. We're human beings. So to me, one of the most insightful quotes that I've ever heard comes from mindfulness. It's from Viktor Frankl, who is a Holocaust survivor. And I'm not going to do justice to the quote because I can't remember it by heart, but people can then Google for the right words. But it's basically between stimulus and response, there's a space. The wider that space is, the more chance we'll have to respond from a place of choice and not just from reactivity. Right now in journalism, that space is nothing. So we need to start also widening the space. So you were talking about the balance, not always breaking. If you're doing breaking news, space is zero. Now we need to balance that as well. And it's not as easy as you put it. I hope editors listen to you and we're like, yeah, but we are used to story after story after story after story, clickbait. And we also need to change what we think works, which actually is not what really works.
I'm interested in exactly what you landed on. So it's great to say people shouldn't be if it bleeds, it leads. Mm-hmm. But there's not only norms and practices, there's incentives, right? I mean, a lot of journalists I've spoken to saying, yeah, that's great. Talking about solutions, wonderful, good job. You go do that, Nat, that's great. Meanwhile, I am incentivized. I have a job in which I have to present messages in a certain way because that's what sells. And so I'm interested in how do we change that? It's not just like you said, it's not just norms and practices. It's like a structure. It is a system that is set up to incentivize certain stories and make other stories, even if they work, really hard to tell and sell. So how do we do that?
So I wish I had the answers.
Okay, I was hoping to.
The same way you were candid about not being a journalist, let me just be candid in that I'm not an expert in solutions journalism. We need a systemic change, both at the journalism media level, we need a systemic change in terms of society, right? So we need to be able to click on those stories more. Just know that if you click on those stories more, then you're giving them an argument to do more of those stories. And then we also need, to produce more of those and understand that they work. I mean, there's so many examples that this is what people are hungry for.
That's my follow-up also. Is there a story or a moment that you have seen framed the way that you would like it to be framed, more solutions-oriented, less clickbait, less breaking news? Can you tell us about it? Does something come to mind?
So I'm going to mention an example about something very simple, which is digital overwhelm. So I don't know one person in the world that doesn't feel digital overwhelmed. This is my default topic in dinners. And because we're with our phone, it's what do we do? And so many messages, and then you get the same message through 3 different channels. And The Guardian did a newsletter, I can't recall specifically the name, about how to mitigate digital overwhelm, how to have a healthy relationship with their own devices. And instantly, within days, became the most read product The Guardian, the newspaper from the UK, had done. So we were like, wait, what? People really want to know how to deal with their phones? And it's duh. So that's the example that comes to mind. Okay.
Most of my examples come from advocate storytelling and activists and organizers who have made deliberate decisions to kind of tell stories, both what in that field is called ethical storytelling, not putting people who you are getting to stand up and tell their stories to do things that they don't want to do that make them kind of re-experience harm.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I've done a lot of work on early childhood development and kind of how science from early childhood development can make its way out into policymaking, decision-making, and public audiences. And I think that from the beginning, and I say the beginning, I've been doing this work for 20 years with that field, they've been really careful not to kind of feed into crisis inflation and emergency fatigue. And they always have, it's basically what you said, they always have this set of almost like how-tos, things to think about, examples of communities that are doing things. And it's just it's compulsory. When they talk about a problem, of which there are many, whether it's childcare or youth mental health, they are just unwilling to have that conversation without, or unless they can, get some of those solutions mapped on as well. So it's become habit for them that I cannot talk about how bad things are and leave people there. I must give people a place to go. I must give people concrete examples of good stuff being done in particular communities that is having positive results and outcomes. And it is irresponsible for me to do this one without this one.
And you're making me think of this documentary, The Social Dilemma, that was on Netflix. I'm not sure if you've watched it, but it interviews some former employees of tech companies about, how tech companies are creating tech, especially social media companies are creating tech that is addictive or that creates some sort of incentives for addiction. And what I really liked about that, so it's another example, right, is the documentary had a campaign parallel to that. So if you went to the website, it's like, okay, what can you do to make your devices less addictive? What can you do to hold tech companies into account? What can you do to actually hold a viewing of this documentary in your community? And here are some talking points. So it gave you different entry points, depending on what you wanted to do, to take action. And I think that that's one of the problems that the media is having right now is a lot of the young journalists, they're like, I don't want to do this. Like, I want to have, make the world a better place. And you're just telling what's happening, And that's also why influencers are being so successful. Many times they speak from the heart. They speak from own personal experience when traditional journalists have been told, don't immerse yourself in a story, tell things in the third voice, which I think it makes sense in many ways, but like in some other ways not. And that's why I speak up about my own challenges with mental health. And that's why I say, hey, I had depression. Hey, I had burnt out. And, you can have a Pulitzer Prize and burn out. And you can, then recover after that and you can continue with your life. And I think, we need to be able to speak up more from where we are at. That's what people need. The opposite of fear is hope. So that's how we counteract the fear that is being spread around.
We have only a couple of minutes, so I'm just going to ask one question, which is to say, if you could change one thing, however small, like a tangible, practical thing, not a system, in how people tell stories or how we train journalists, what would that be?
I would tell every journalist out there and every content creator, everybody who are telling stories, that you have a big responsibility. Therefore, make sure you take care of yourself so that you can show up in your best version to others.
Mine is the same up until halfway through that sentence, right? So realize, not just journalists, but people who make things that RPs, that real people actually watch and want to watch, is that your job obviously has an entertainment component. You are trying to tell good stories, but you also have a responsibility for the larger environment in which people are making decisions and understanding issues. And it's not just telling the truth or telling a good story, but there is an ethics and a responsibility to that storytelling. And that would be the one thing that I would want people to know, that how you say what you have to say is incredibly important and can be the difference between emergency inflation and crisis fatigue and people turning away and tuning it out and losing faith in vital institutions like journalism, and being hopeful and realizing and thinking that there are things that can be done that would make this world and the issues that we care about better.